Elena had worked 3 double shifts in a row at the hospital, caught exactly 2 hours of sleep, and was running on nothing but coffee and determination when she stumbled onto what she thought was her budget flight to Vegas. Instead, she found herself face to face with a man whose cologne probably cost more than her monthly rent. The fluorescent lights of JFK Airport blurred together as Elena shuffled through the terminal, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Her scrubs still carried the faint scent of disinfectant after 72 hours straight in the ICU. The boarding pass trembled in her exhausted hands as she squinted at what she thought was Gate 23B. Her first vacation in 3 years, a weekend escape to Vegas with her nursing school friend Megan, felt like a distant dream as she fought to stay upright. The past 3 days had been a nightmare of medical emergencies and understaffed shifts. Chen, in room 302, had coded twice. The new intern had made dangerous mistakes that Elena quietly corrected, and she had managed exactly 2 hours of sleep on the break room couch before rushing home to shower and grab her pre-packed bag. Her phone buzzed with frantic messages from Megan about boarding announcements and gate changes. Elena's exhausted mind couldn't process the information properly. She followed what appeared to be other passengers toward a boarding area, too tired to notice the subtle differences in her surroundings. The carpet was plush here, the lighting warmer, the atmosphere more refined than typical airline chaos. A uniformed woman approached Elena with a professional smile that seemed genuine rather than the tired politeness of overworked airline staff. She glanced at Elena's phone screen instead of requesting a boarding pass, nodding with apparent recognition. Elena was too exhausted to question the unusual procedure or correct what seemed to be a case of mistaken identity when the woman addressed her as Miss Jenkins. Elena found herself walking through a corridor that felt more like a luxury hotel than an airport terminal. The walls displayed subtle artwork, and plush carpeting silenced her footsteps. Other passengers moved with different energy here, more relaxed and assured, carrying designer luggage and wearing clothes that cost more than Elena made in a month. She clutched her worn backpack tighter, suddenly aware of how out of place she appeared. The boarding tunnel led not to a cramped budget airline cabin, but to what could only be described as a flying mansion. Elena stopped in the doorway, her tired mind struggling to process the scene before her. Cream leather seats, large enough to sleep in, were positioned around polished wooden tables. Crystal glasses caught light from oversized windows, and fresh flowers adorned elegant side tables. This was definitely not Flight 4. A man sat alone in the luxurious cabin, his back to the entrance as he gazed out at the tarmac. He wore a navy suit that fit perfectly, the kind of tailoring that spoke of serious money and sophisticated taste. His dark hair was styled with casual precision, and even from behind he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. When he turned at the sound of her arrival, Elena felt her breath catch. He was younger than expected, perhaps early 30s, with striking blue eyes that seemed to take in everything about her in a single glance. His features were sharp and aristocratic, the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers or corporate boardrooms. There was an intensity to his gaze that made Elena acutely aware of her rumpled scrubs, messy ponytail, and the exhaustion written across every line of her face. The man studied her with obvious confusion, his eyes moving from her worn sneakers to her hospital ID badge. Elena could see the exact moment when realization dawned in his expression, followed by something that looked like amusement rather than anger. He set down his crystal tumbler and rose from his seat with fluid grace. Elena's mind raced as she tried to process the situation. The exhaustion that had clouded her judgment suddenly lifted enough for her to understand the magnitude of her mistake. She had somehow boarded a private jet belonging to a man who looked like he could buy her entire neighborhood without checking his bank balance. The engines were already humming to life, and through the windows she could see ground crew removing the boarding stairs. The man approached her with careful steps, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. When he spoke, his voice was deep and cultured, with an accent that suggested expensive education and international travel. He introduced himself as Damien Carter, and the name sent recognition through Elena's tired mind. Even exhausted, she knew that name from business magazines and news reports. Damien Carter, the tech billionaire who had built an empire from nothing. Elena managed to tell him her name, her voice barely above a whisper as the full reality crashed over her. She was Elena Morris, a nurse from Queens who lived paycheck to paycheck and had saved 8 months to afford this weekend trip to Vegas. Now she stood in a private jet worth more than she would earn in several lifetimes, face to face with one of the most powerful men in America. Damien listened to her stammered explanation with surprising patience. She had expected anger, demands for immediate removal, perhaps threats of legal action. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about how she had managed to board his jet undetected. The exhaustion had made everything blur together, she explained, gate numbers and departure times mixing in her sleep-deprived mind, until she had simply followed the crowd and trusted she was in the right place. As the jet taxied toward the runway, Damien explained their destination with casualness that took Elena's breath away. Paris, he said, as if it were as simple as a trip to the grocery store. A weekend business trip before important meetings. Monday morning, he had been expecting someone else, a companion whose last-minute cancellation had left him traveling alone. The irony wasn't lost on Elena that her accidental presence had filled a void she never could have imagined existing. The takeoff felt surreal, as if Elena were watching it happen to someone else. She pressed her face to the window as New York City fell away beneath them, the lights of her world growing smaller and more distant. Somewhere down there, Megan was probably still waiting at their gate, wondering where her friend had disappeared. Somewhere down there was Elena's small apartment, her job at the hospital, her carefully planned and rigidly budgeted life. Damien had moved to the seat across from her, maintaining respectful distance while making it clear that conversation was welcome. Elena found herself studying his face, looking for signs of the ruthless businessman she had read about. Instead, she saw something unexpected, a loneliness that seemed at odds with his obvious success and power. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and heavy responsibilities. The flight crew moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, offering refreshments and ensuring their comfort. Elena accepted coffee gratefully, surprised by the quality and richness of what was probably some exotic blend she had never heard of. The food that appeared seemed to materialize from thin air, perfectly prepared dishes that bore no resemblance to the vending machine meals that had sustained her through recent shifts. As hours passed and her exhaustion began to lift under the influence of real food and genuine rest, Elena found herself drawn into conversation with Damien. He was nothing like she had expected a billionaire to be. There was no arrogance or condescension in his manner, no sense that he viewed her as beneath his notice. Instead, he listened with genuine interest as she talked about her work, her patience, and the satisfaction she found in a career that prioritized service over profit. Damien shared his own story in return, painting a picture of success that came with its own challenges and isolation. He spoke of pressure to constantly perform, to justify the trust of investors and employees who depended on his decisions. The higher he climbed in the business world, the more difficult it became to form genuine connections with people who saw him as a person rather than a net worth figure. His recent relationship had ended when it became clear his girlfriend was more interested in his lifestyle than in him as an individual. Elena found herself feeling unexpected sympathy for this man who seemed to have everything but connection. In her world, relationships were formed through shared struggles and mutual support. Her friendships with fellow nurses were built on trust earned through difficult shifts in life-or-death situations. Her bond with patients came from being present during their most vulnerable moments. Damien's world seemed to offer little opportunity for such authentic human connection. As they flew through the night over the Atlantic, Elena began to understand that this accidental journey was serving a purpose for both of them. For her, it was a forced break from relentless demands of her job and financial pressures. For him, it was a chance to interact with someone who knew nothing about his business empire and cared nothing about his wealth. They were both escaping, in their own ways, from lives that had become too narrow and demanding. The conversation flowed naturally between them, touching on everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. Elena learned that Damien had grown up in modest circumstances, his success the result of brilliant timing, relentless work, and calculated risks most people would never dare take. His wealth was relatively recent, and he still sometimes felt like an outsider in the world of private jets and exclusive clubs. Elena shared her own background, growing up in a working-class family where every dollar was carefully budgeted. Her choice to become a nurse had been motivated by genuine desire to help people, but it had also been practical, offering job security and decent benefits. She had never imagined traveling to Paris, never dreamed of staying in luxury hotels or dining at world-class restaurants. Her vacations were weekend trips to nearby beaches or visits to family within driving distance. As dawn began to break over the European coastline, both Elena and Damien seemed to realize their time together was limited. Soon they would land in Paris, and the magical suspension of reality that had characterized their night flight would come to an end. Elena would need to figure out how to get home, how to explain her absence to her supervisor, how to return to the carefully structured life she had built. Damien made his offer with careful consideration, clearly aware of how it might be received. He had hotel reservations, originally intended for 2 people. He would be happy to arrange separate accommodations for Elena, cover her expenses during her unexpected stay in Paris, and ensure her safe return to New York whenever she was ready. He presented it not as charity but as a practical solution to an unusual problem, a way to make the best of an extraordinary situation. Elena's initial instinct was to refuse, to insist on finding her own way back to familiar ground as quickly as possible. The gap between their worlds seemed too vast to bridge, even temporarily. She worried about implications of accepting such generosity from a virtual stranger, regardless of how genuine his intentions appeared. Her pride rebelled against being anyone's charity case, even accidentally. But as Paris appeared below them, a sprawling tapestry of history and beauty, unlike anything Elena had ever seen, she felt something stir within her that had been dormant for years. It was curiosity, adventure, the part of her that had once dreamed of seeing the world before responsibility and financial reality had narrowed her horizons. When was the last time she had done something spontaneous, something just for joy rather than necessity or obligation? The landing was smooth, barely disturbing the crystal glasses or fresh flowers that decorated their flying sanctuary. As they taxied toward a private terminal, Elena could see the city of lights spreading around them, its famous landmarks rising like promises from the morning mist. This was Paris, the city of her childhood dreams, the destination she had promised herself she would visit someday when she had saved enough money and vacation time. Damien watched her reaction to the city with obvious pleasure, seeming to rediscover Paris through her wondering eyes. He pointed out famous landmarks and promised to show her hidden gems that most tourists never discover. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Elena found herself agreeing to stay for the weekend, to accept his hospitality and allow herself this one impractical, magical interlude in her carefully planned life. The hotel was everything Elena had imagined when she dreamed of Parisian luxury. The Ritz-Carlton rose before them like a palace, its elegant facade promising the kind of service and attention that existed only in movies and magazines. Damien handled their arrival with practiced ease, ensuring Elena was treated with the same respect and consideration he received. Her room was a suite larger than her entire apartment, with windows opening onto views of the Tuileries Gardens. Their first day in Paris unfolded like a dream sequence. Damien proved an excellent guide, knowledgeable about the city's history and passionate about its culture. They visited the Louvre in the morning, where Elena stood transfixed before masterpieces she had only seen in textbooks. The Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile seemed to hold secrets Elena was only beginning to understand, lessons about mystery and possibility that her practical life had never taught her. Lunch was at a small bistro Damien had discovered during previous visits, a place where food was simple but perfect and atmosphere was warm with genuine French hospitality. Elena found herself relaxing in ways she had forgotten were possible, letting go of the constant vigilance that characterized her working life. There were no patients to monitor, no schedules to maintain, no financial worries to calculate and recalculate. The afternoon brought a cruise along the Seine, where Paris revealed itself from a different perspective. The city's famous bridges arched over them like blessings, and afternoon light turned the water into liquid gold. Elena watched the world slide by from their small boat's deck, conscious that she was storing up memories that would have to last a lifetime. This was not her real life, she reminded herself, but rather a beautiful accident that would soon end. Damien seemed to understand her thoughts without her voicing them. He spoke little during the boat ride, content to share the beauty of the moment without demanding conversation or attention. Elena appreciated his sensitivity, his ability to give her space to process the overwhelming changes of the past 24 hours. In her experience, people always wanted something from her, whether medical care, emotional support, or simply her time and energy. Damien appeared to want nothing more than her company and authentic reactions to new experiences. Dinner that evening was at a restaurant. So exclusive, Elena was certain it normally required reservations months in advance. The maitre d' greeted Damien by name and led them to a table with perfect views of the Eiffel Tower, which sparkled with lights as darkness fell over the city. Elena wore the one dress she had packed for Vegas, suddenly grateful for Megan's insistence that she bring something nice just in case. The meal was a revelation, each course more perfect than the last. Elena had never experienced food as art, flavors and textures combined in ways that seemed almost magical. Damien ordered wine that probably cost more than her monthly salary, but he presented it without pretension, simply as something beautiful to be shared and enjoyed. Their conversation ranged over topics Elena had never discussed with anyone: philosophy and art and the meaning of success and happiness. As they walked back to the hotel through Paris streets that seemed designed for romance, Elena felt dangerous warmth growing in her chest. This was not just gratitude for an unexpected adventure or appreciation for Damien's generosity. This was something deeper and more complicated, an attraction that went beyond the obvious appeal of his wealth and sophistication. She found herself drawn to his intelligence, his thoughtfulness, the way he listened when she spoke as if her opinions truly mattered. Back at the hotel, they parted ways at Elena's door, with careful politeness that barely concealed the tension building between them. Elena knew that crossing the line from grateful recipient of kindness to something more would complicate everything, would make their eventual parting infinitely more difficult. She also knew she was already halfway to falling for this man who had rescued her from her own exhaustion and shown her possibilities she had never imagined. Their second day in Paris began with breakfast on Elena's balcony, room service presenting food that made even the simple act of eating feel luxurious. Damien arrived with pastries from his favorite bakery and stories about his first trip to Paris as a struggling college student who could barely afford youth hostel accommodations. The contrast between that young man and the successful businessman he had become was not lost on Elena, who saw parallels to her own journey from uncertain nursing student to confident medical professional. They spent the morning in Montmartre, climbing cobblestone streets to reach Sacré-Cœur Basilica that crowned the highest point in Paris. The view from the steps was breathtaking, the entire city spread below them like a detailed map of human dreams and ambitions. Street artists worked nearby, capturing likenesses of tourists and locals alike, their sketches somehow conveying more personality than Elena had ever seen in formal portraits. Damien surprised her by commissioning one of the artists to draw Elena's portrait, sitting patiently as the man captured her profile against the backdrop of the Paris skyline. When the sketch was finished, Elena barely recognized herself. The artist had seen something in her face she had never noticed, a combination of strength and vulnerability that made her appear both beautiful and mysterious. Damien studied the drawing with obvious pleasure before presenting it to her as a memento of their time together. The afternoon brought shopping along the Champs-Élysées, where Elena window shopped while Damien occasionally insisted on buying her small gifts despite her protests. A silk scarf that brought out the color of her eyes, a small bottle of perfume that smelled like spring flowers, a book of Paris photography that would help her remember every detail of their adventure. Each gift was chosen with thought and consideration, selected not for expense but for meaning and appropriateness. Elena found herself relaxing into the luxury, allowing herself to experience generosity without the constant calculation of cost and obligation that usually characterized her interactions with money. Damien's wealth was so vast that these purchases meant nothing to him financially, but his pleasure in giving them to her transformed them into something precious. She began to understand that true generosity was not about the size of the gift, but about the spirit in which it was offered. Their final evening in Paris arrived too quickly, marked by dinner at another impossible restaurant and a night walk along the Seine that seemed designed to break Elena's heart. The city revealed all its romantic secrets as they strolled, couples kissing on bridges, musicians playing softly in small squares, the warm glow of cafe windows promising endless conversations and shared dreams. Damien spoke carefully about his return to New York, his upcoming business meetings, and the resumption of his normal life. Elena talked about her job at the hospital, her patients who would be wondering about her absence, and her return to the routine that had defined her existence before this magical interruption. Neither mentioned the obvious question of whether they would see each other again, whether this weekend would remain a beautiful memory or evolve into something more lasting. Standing on the Pont des Arts as midnight approached, Elena felt the weight of impending goodbye settling over them like fog. In a few hours, they would board Damien's jet for the return flight to New York. By tomorrow evening, she would be back in her small apartment, preparing for her next shift at Memorial Hospital, trying to convince herself this weekend had actually happened. Damien turned to her as the clock tower chimed midnight, marking the official end of their Paris adventure. The lights of the city reflected in his eyes as he struggled to find words for what they had shared. Elena saw her own feelings reflected in his expression, the reluctance to let go of something beautiful and unexpected, the fear that returning to their separate worlds would diminish what they had discovered together. The kiss that followed was inevitable, a recognition of feelings that had been building since their first conversation on the plane. It was gentle and questioning at first, then deeper as Elena responded with honesty that surprised them both. For a moment, the gap between their worlds seemed irrelevant, overcome by the simple human connection they had found in each other. But reality reasserted itself as they broke apart, practical considerations that would face them back in New York, looming like storm clouds. Elena's life was structured around necessity and responsibility, leaving little room for the kind of relationship that would be required to bridge their different circumstances. Damien's world was one of constant travel, high-stakes decisions, and social obligations that would be foreign and uncomfortable for someone with Elena's background. The flight home was quieter than their journey to Paris, both lost in thoughts about what they had shared and what would happen next. Elena dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with images of Paris streets and the feeling of Damien's hand in hers. When she woke, he was working on his laptop, already mentally preparing for the meetings and decisions that awaited him. JFK Airport felt harsh and utilitarian after the elegance of their Parisian adventure. The customs process reminded Elena of practical realities she would face, questions about her travels that she could barely answer herself. Damien's driver was waiting with a car that would take Elena home to Queens while Damien returned to his Manhattan penthouse and his billion-dollar responsibilities. Their goodbye in the airport was awkward, weighted with things they couldn't say and promises they couldn't make. Damien pressed his business card into Elena's hand, asking her to call him, to not let this end with their return to familiar ground. Elena accepted the card knowing she probably wouldn't use it, understanding that some magic was too fragile to survive in the harsh light of ordinary life. But as she sat in the taxi watching the city lights blur past her window, Elena realized that Paris had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had tasted a different kind of life, had seen herself through the eyes of someone who believed she was worthy of beautiful things and extraordinary experiences. Whether or not she ever saw Damien Carter again, she would never be quite the same person who had stumbled exhausted onto the wrong plane just 3 days before.